Hello and welcome to today's conversation on our series, Era of Reclamation. We're delighted to have you, and Bonnie Greer and myself, we're delighted to have Lonnie Bunch as our guest today. But before I introduce Lonnie and Bonnie, let me say a few words about Era of Reclamation. Era of Reclamation goes back to conversations Bonnie and I have had in 2019, thinking about a series of conversations on topics that matter today. The title we've come up with together was Era of Reclamation, an era where individuals, groups, and nations reclaim their rights, their history, the multitude of identities, and the joy of interacting with each other. We've had several conversations in this series, all very successful, and I've been extremely fortunate to have Bonnie as the lead curator of Era of Reclamation and to work with her. Bonnie, as you all know, famous playwright, author, commentator, journalist, former deputy chair of the British Museum, has been a friend of the British Museum and of all museums as public institutions, and has shaped this series over the last year. And today we have the great privilege and the great joy of welcoming Lonnie Bunch, author, educator, and great museum director, founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, just next to Washington Memorial, one of the greatest museum achievements of our time. And we're going to hear more about that in a bit. And since 2019, Lonnie is the 14th secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, the biggest museum institution anywhere in the world, with 90 museums, research institutes, a zoo, and many more. And with that, over to you, Bonnie. Lonnie, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hartwig. And just to add a little bit on what you said, one of the very powerful things and important things to say about Era of Reclamation is that this is a collaboration. It isn't a top-down exercise. It isn't, we'll let you in and you do what you need to do. This is a collaboration in which Hartwig and I, along with colleagues, are thinking together, shaping together, moving with the time, and trying to understand the time. But mostly trying to understand and shape and think about and make objects for now that look at how museums are to respond to this time, not the past, but this time. And so it is with great pleasure to do this excavation with one of the greatest historians of our time, and also a great museum founder and a great museum director. And I just want to say this especially for everyone who's not American. And I'm going to refer to the Secretary General, if he doesn't mind, as Lonnie, because he's an old friend and he's a friend of Hartwig's too. So we're going to call him Lonnie as we continue, if he doesn't mind. Lonnie Bunch is founder, created the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which was commissioned or given permission to be part of the Smithsonian 100 years ago. So this is a feat of huge scope. And it was really in his beautiful memoir and book, A Fool's Errand, which I started crying before we came on, because it's just, not only is it precise and incisive, as you expect from such an eminent historian, it's so full of stories, so full of heart. And any of you thinking about making a museum, and I hope people are. This is a primer. This is beautifully told, very, very accessible. And I love it. I'm reading it again. But and I shouldn't say but, and the other monumental thing that Lonnie's accomplished is he is the Secretary General of the director of the largest museum complex on earth. Lonnie is even in charge of a zoo. So it is, and to be the first person of African descent, an African-American descendant of enslaved peoples like I am, to be in Washington, to head up this museum, it is not comparable to anything else. So for him to be giving us this time is enormous. And Lonnie, there's a lot of stuff to ask you. I mean, you're in a besieged city, the capital of the United States of America, which was almost sacked by a marauding mob who basically made up of white supremacists and anti-government people. Something that as an historian has always been a part of the United States. Is nothing new. They just came out of the woodwork this time. I just have one question. I got two. What moment are we in now, Lonnie? Where are we? What's happening? Not only in the United States, but in the world right now, as you see it.
Well, first of all, let me thank both of you for allowing me to participate. You're both people that I care a great deal about. I care about the British Museum, and obviously, as you know, I spent a lot of time in the UK, and I'm very honored to be with you. So thank you for allowing me to participate in this extremely important series of conversations. Where we are is an amazing moment. We're at a time of loss. We're at a time of anger. We're at a time of racial conflict. We're at a time where people attack the government in a way that no one ever thought would ever happen. And that, in essence, we're at a time of crisis. But we're at a time also where I think this is where cultural institutions are at their best. We're at a time where cultural institutions should be the glue that holds countries, communities together. The cultural institutions, like museums, ought to be the place that contextualizes, that challenges, but that brings understanding, so that we have people who are trying to understand where we are. We have the information and we have the trust to do that. Where we are at a moment that I never thought I'd see on so many levels. A moment where I never thought I'd see African Americans playing such a large role, Secretary of Defense, the Vice President. But we're also at a place where issues of race are crucially important in the United States. And so much of what you saw in the attack on the Capitol was about race, was about white supremacy. But we're also at a place globally where now people around the world are asking, how do I reclaim my full identity? How do I claim my identity as being African descendant, for example? But how do I claim my British identity? So in essence, this is a real time where you either have a moment of transformation or it's going to be a moment of frustration and concern.
And rage. Lonnie, I talk about frustration, and this is a kind of generational frustration on my part. You and I are the same age. Our fathers were served in this country, in the United Kingdom, in a segregated army. Now we've got an African-American man as head of the military, which our fathers would never have. You could even tell them that this would ever happen. But having said that, I worked with Fred Hampton for a minute in the Black Panther Party. Chicago very well as the head of the Chicago Historical Society, another first that you did, which is, if anybody knows Chicago, would have been unthinkable when we were children that a Black man headed up that august institution. We went through a lot of things. And now I see the younger people in the Black Lives Matter movement, which I call Black Lives Matter too. How come I'm sitting there listening to them saying the same things we said, in the streets the same way we were, in the stuff we're going through? How do museums talk about this in a
Well, I think
way
you've
that they get the link?
Well, I think you put your finger on what is a real issue. In many countries, especially the United States, we're ahistorical, right? That every generation feels they're reinventing the wheel. And that in essence, part of the role of cultural institutions, part of the role of people that care about history, whether it's on television, in theater, in museums, the role is to make sure those stories are told in a way that isn't sort of, old people saying, oh, we knew how to do this, but rather to say that one, the challenge for fairness, the challenge for equality in any country is an eternal process. That in essence, you don't get to the promised land. What you do is get to way stations on the way to the promised land. And that what you want is people to be able to not be held captive by the past, but to understand the traditions, understand the ideas, understand the tactics, and then make that work for a new generation. But don't believe that there hasn't been change, and don't believe that there haven't been people on whose shoulders you stand. And I think the challenge for us all is to recognize, how do we help new generations understand they are standing on amazing shoulders, that there has been loss, there has been strategy, there has been gain, and that now the goal is push us forward. As I rarely quote Thomas Jefferson, but he was right. He said, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.
But
Before I say a word about the British Museum, Lonnie, I think just thinking about my experience of visiting the National Museum of African American History and Culture, it is, as you say, creating a place where your stories can be told and can be heard and can be appreciated as a key contribution to the community or the entire country you live in, your family has been living in, and that to whose success you've contributed. I think it's more, if I remember, I went back several times to that museum because it blew my mind. Just standing in the hall, watching people coming in, finding their way around, talking to each other. This big hall, it's quite awe-inspiring. And I just felt there was an other dimension to it. Those who came into the museum, African Americans, as well as white Americans, as well as any other members of minorities and visitors, my feeling was they felt represented. The museum you have created, with the help of communities across the country, is a place of representation. And I think when we talk about reclamation, when we talk about feeling that you are a valued member of the community whose voice is being heard, museums as places of representation play a very important part.
I think that's really important. I think what you've really put your finger on is what I argue is the change that has to happen in museums. I've always felt that I became a better historian when I began to work with the living community, right? Rather than sort of be distant. And that I believe that museums are made better when they recognize that their job, in some ways, is to fit the museum to the needs of the community. And when I thought about building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I thought about it through several different lenses. One was that this was a museum that was going to be on the National Mall. And for those who don't know it, the National Mall is where the symbols of America, the Capitol, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Smithsonian. And I thought just being on that mall changes the discourse. So much of the mall was white marble, and suddenly here's a building that had a little bit of color to it. That basically said there has always been a dark presence in America that often gets underlooked or undervalued. Now it's here. But then the next step was to say, how do you make sure this is a story for us all? Because I've argued the one thing I've learned is that the story of Black America is in some ways the quintessential American story. It's the story that helps us understand the best of America and the worst of America. It's the story that has shaped every aspect of American life. And so what I wanted was I wanted people of African descent to say they're home. I wanted them to feel that this was who they were. But I wanted everybody to recognize this is your story too. That all of us, regardless of race, regardless of how long we've been in the United States, all of us have been shaped by and made better by the African American experience. So that was crucially important to say that this, if this just became a museum that people visited and went away without recognizing this was really what I would argue a revolutionary act to say that this is a story that helps us understand where we come together rather than simply where we're separate. And so I had a mission for this museum to be a place that mattered, to be a place of value, to be a place that candidly challenged the country to look at itself in a candid way. But I wanted it to be a museum that would reveal the past, would allow us to understand and contextualize where we are today, but would point us towards a better future.
Yeah. And I remember you saying, Bonnie, you remember this, when you came to the British Museum and addressed the patrons of the British Museum, you said this was not about solely about the African American communities. This was about the American experience through the lens or highlighted by the specific contribution of African Americans.
And I think what was so important about that was what I was trying to do, and this is something really I learned from President Obama. I realized that part of a revolutionary action is claiming the totality of your identity as African descended, your identity as American. And so I really wanted that to be a place where we suddenly have a new definition of America's identity, a multiracial identity, an identity that doesn't say these are ancillary stories, but rather these are stories at the heart of who this nation is. And I would argue that the most important contribution that we made, and you're right, there were certain people involved in this, I just got to stand in front, but the most important contribution we made was to say that we can now look at ethnicity, race, in a way that allows us not to narrow, but to expand the aperture. And I think that's, to me, the power of that museum.
Perhaps, Bonnie, could I just quickly add to that? Sorry. And I think there you touch upon something that is true, holds true for many museums, that talking about the history of humankind obviously talks about strife, conflict, loss, destruction, as well as about creation and peaceful exchange and mutual inspiration. And in a way, the museum contains all that, but it creates a peaceful space where all these conflicts, even your own conflicts, the conflicts of your own country, but perhaps even the conflicts you carry inside yourself as an individual, can be looked at, can be addressed, can be brought out, can turn into the subject of conversation. I think that's, that if you think about the civic role of museums as places where these conflicts, and we have seen how strong and relevant they are today, it's a forum where you can negotiate these conflicts, I think.
Exactly. And so it really is, first of all, recognizing that people have a thirst to understand complexity. And that I would argue that one of the most important things museums need to do around the world is to help their audience embrace ambiguity, right? Too often we look for simple answers to complex questions. And what I really wanted in this museum was I wanted people to work. right? I didn't want them to just stroll through the museum. I want them to work. I want them to grapple with this. And I wanted to reduce history to human scale. I didn't want anybody to say, oh my God, slavery. I wanted them to say, look at the story through the lens of that family or that cabin, that one artifact. So by reducing it to human scale, I wanted to give people the freedom to interact, to have that conversation. And that's what I thought was so powerful about the museum, bringing people of diverse races, different parts of the world together, and they share those moments of recognizing this is their story too. And I think that in some ways, what you put your finger on is the notion that museums need to be a little more courageous, to recognize that they tell these important stories at their heart, but shine the light on those dark corners. Recognize that people need, even if sometimes they don't want to, they need to grapple with these things. I've always been struck by something somebody I interviewed many years ago, a former sharecropper said. He said, your job as a historian is to give the people not just what they want, but what they need.
Exactly.
That what I think is what museums need to do.
Exactly, exactly. Lonnie, I've made two observations that um, I've spoken about with with Hartwig and other people, and it's part of one of the drivers for me in making Era of Reclamation with Hartwig and others. And this is a foreigner's observation in the sense that I was not raised here. One is that unlike the United States in general, where museums are civic institutions, they're the great and the good, and if you are, say, and which was so monumental about you heading up the Chicago Historical Society, is that's a prime example of the great and the good deciding what they're going to do, what they want to do in the middle of the prairie. So, you know, and then you come along and they nominate you and say, direct this for us, which is incredible, and it's very important to say. So but European museums, in my experience, are not civic institutions. They become civic institutions as the culture changes, but they're beginning in a way creates and establishes the state itself and defines it itself. The second thing that is interesting to me, and I don't know how you feel about this, but I think that African America has a huge hold, and I think too much of a hold, on the way ideas, language, points of view are shaped in this country and in Europe. I hear a lot of jargon and talk that really comes from that matrix. And sometimes I feel like, yeah, but, well, you know, so I think that a lot of us back home don't realize the absolute power that African America has over the rest of the thinking and the feeling and the thought of the rest of Meta Africa, which is what I call those of us. So just your feeling about the sort of need to impact on these museums who did not come from the people or not of the people. And secondly, if you agree with me about, for me, the over influence of African American thought, jargon, books on the story of what's happening here.
I think, let me answer the second part first. I think in many ways, I was always struck by many of the times I spent in the UK for the last 25 years, how there was both a thirst to understand the African American experience and a resistance that this isn't our experience here in the UK. And so I think the challenge is to find the
We lost Lonnie Unimportant.
Lonnie's temporary.
And this was going to be it's going to be the big. I think it's on Lonnie's end.
Let's bring him on again.
Yes.
There he is. Unmuting. Lonnie, we see you. You just have to unmute. There you are.
Okay,
Bravo.
I apologize.
Bravo.
You know,
Great.
there is nothing worse than giving a historian the opportunity to work with 21st century technology. So it's got to be me. I must have touched something. But my point is to Bonnie that I think that the key is to find that right tension between what are the lessons, the ability to draw from a culture, but how to make sure that that culture doesn't overwhelm the culture that is there. You know, it's a very different experience. I mean, I think there are many lessons that I think are really, what is really important. Um, Many lessons that seem to me to be really important in terms of what we can do. But I think the key is to understand that not all of nothing is something easily transferable. That I think it's important that what happens, I'm talking about issues of African descent, issues of race in the UK, where you can learn from the US, great, but you really have to create your own environment to understand where you are. I also think, though, it is really important for museums to figure out how they're of value. Not every museum is going to be of value in the same way, but I would argue that every museum has to have a contemporary resonance, whether it's social justice, whether it's helping people understand ethnicity and race, whether it's looking at work, issues of gender. But I would argue that because museums are these trusted sources, then they have a responsibility, an obligation to really define themselves in a way that says, here's how we matter, here's how we help.
And I, you could of course ask Lonnie. Now you have this fabulous museum for the history and culture, the contribution of African Americans to the history of the US. How about other groups or minorities, if you want to call them that? How well are they represented? What kind of development do you see in the future? And perhaps I could add one more question. In a way, what you highlighted was that it is not about separating out. It is actually inserting into,
Exactly.
so that you get a much better understanding of the whole and its constituent parts and the contribution of various individuals and communities. So I think that's, in a way, it's about the balance between the individual and the groups and the whole. And you could enlarge that actually to look at the whole world and say, what role do museums have in a moment where we feel that countries are separating from each other, walls are coming up, literally, and yet we are that global community, and all the big issues we are facing, we can only solve through close collaboration.
In many ways, what you've really put your finger on is that, first of all, it's important in every nation to think about how do you explore diversity, ethnicity, and inclusion. And I would argue what the African American Museum does is what you actually put in what I would argue is the change for museums. You no longer have to do a museum that looks at Latino issues or Asian American issues or women's issues solely through that lens, but rather you use that lens to ask the broader question of what it means to be an American. And I think that I'm hopeful that the African American Museum opens a door for other museums. And candidly, as you may know, Congress in the United States just asked me and the Smithsonian to build 2 new museums, a museum of Latino culture and a museum of women's culture. Now, to be truthful, it was hard enough for me to build 1, but now I got to build 2. Okay. But the truth is that those are important parts of helping people understand the complexity and the nuance of a nation. So as long as I can sort of lay a foundation where they are really not museums that are built by and for a community, but rather are built by and for a community to help everybody understand themselves better. I think that's the future, not just at the Smithsonian. I think that's the future of museums around the country, around the world, really. And I think it really gets back to this question of what do you define as your role? What is the greater good that you can do? I believe very strongly that we all have tools to help a nation. And I think that you have to figure out what your tools are. For me, it was history and museums. I think the museums have a real responsibility to say, how do we find the right tension between tradition and innovation, between what we're comfortable doing and what we need to do? And so I think that what is exciting to me about this time is that this is a time that museums can't sit on the sideline. If they want to be relevant, if they want to have the impact, if they want to get the resources they need. And I think that's going to be a challenge. But oh, what an opportunity. What a time it is that I hope somebody looks back 100 years from now and says, what a horrible moment the world went through. But look at how museums changed. Look at how they helped really be the pillars on which nations were reborn. That's what I hope museums can do.
I think, you know, one of my dreams and someday is to create a program in which young people from the community, and I'm talking about people who don't have the privilege of going to elite universities or have had that exposure to that education, but yet have the knowledge. They got the knowledge. They know things. They come from communities that know things, that somehow young people who are going through the traditional educational stream and those young people who know things from the community can come together. When we did at the museum, before Hartwig came and Neil McGregor was the director, we did a commemoration of the abolition of the slave trade. And we called it Resistance and Remembrance. That was a very important thing to say. And one of the things that one of the things that moved me, and this was 10 years ago over, we could see community teachers teaching the objects as well. So you had that going on, and whatever other people thought happened in the British Museum, they were side by side. And somehow if we could make a program or system by which when people enter a museum, those curations can exist on a kind of equal basis together and flow together and merge together.
What is really the challenge is how do you recognize that you're sharing authority and recognize that in many ways what you're really doing is making sure that all people feel a sense of ownership. And I think that's really the challenge as we move forward. But I think that really means that we have to value community knowledge, community scholarship, as well as academic scholarship. We've just got to find, I keep using this word, we just have to find the right tension to make that work. And I think we're made better by that. As I've always said, I became a much better historian as I did more in communities, as I learned from community scholars, community oral historians. And I think that in some ways we value that. We don't value it equally with academic learning. And I think that one of the challenges for us is to find that new meeting, that new integration.
And our experience at the British Museum is that working with communities, and it's as much about ownership, I think, as it is about authorship. And authorship is related to authority. You know, you are the author, and you create the narrative, is that there is a real passion and desire for working with museum, the specialists who work in the museum, who have in-depth knowledge of their areas, and there can be sometimes quite a number of areas, and who share and engage in dialogue. And I think our museums, and that probably, I would assume, goes for the Smithsonian as a whole, as that incredible number of first-rate museums, it goes for the British Museum, that engagement has to be a global engagement. And I think as we move forward in the British Museum, it's about creating the narratives of the future through the display that we're working on. What we've decided to do is to do in global co-curation, which is to say that we involve colleagues and communities from around the world as we embark on the development of the new narratives, which is to say, share authorship, bring in that knowledge that we do not have, and shape something that in the end will lead to this, that everybody coming to those museums feels represented through them. I think, for big institutions, be it under one roof as the British Museum, be it in so many individual institutions, but all close to each other, that is the course towards the future, the path towards the future. And it would allow us, I think, to be that space which is not neutral, that allows us to address very different and at times very difficult and even painful questions, and yet provide the space for, for the coexistence of very different views, and not give that away. Be passionate, but not partial.
I think that's really important. I think on several levels. First of all, as an American, one of the things I know is that Americans revel in isolationism, not understanding their global connectivity, that Americans have always been shaped by global considerations since the inception, and that, as Bonnie said very earlier, African-American culture is global. It has an impact everywhere. So one of the challenges for an American audience is to recognize that just thinking about what's in the borders of the United States is flawed. And so trying to help people think about their global connections is crucially important. Obviously, it's important not just historically, but in climate change issues and the like, so that for me, one of the strengths of the moment is that because of candidly Zoom, we're able to connect with our international colleagues in ways that we didn't in the past. And so I think that what I hope comes out of this moment is a greater connectivity that allows us all to understand how we're connected, but allows us to sort of really break down the notion of American exceptionalism, British exceptionalism, recognizing where we are unique, but where we are sort of shaped by broader considerations. I've always thought that the other thing that changed me as a historian was spending so much time in the UK, in Japan, in South Africa, in China, to understand what equality meant in those different environments, to understand what the challenge of exceptionalism in those contexts were. And it made me just recognize that I will understand America when I understand the globe.
Lonnie, one of the things that I feel about museums, and this is my personal feeling, is objects get in there, are collected under all kinds of circumstances. And I mean, we know that, bad and good, benevolent and otherwise. I've always felt, and this is my personal feeling, that there is a point where, and object, and I don't know when that happens, when there's a kind of mutability, when you talk about ambiguity and you talk about the ambiguity of a museum, the ambiguity of history itself, the ambiguity of the whole thing. And that an object exists and is in existence for a lot of different purposes, and it existed in a lot of different purposes. Does the purpose of an object change? Can the purpose of an object change? Does a museum change the purpose of an object?
I think the notion of museumizing an object changed it by its very definition, right? We've said that's important enough to be preserved. I think the real question for me is how do we, which I've tried to do my whole career, how do we take those collections and rethink them, revisit them, repurpose them, reimagine them? In some ways, I think the notion, I was lucky. When I built the African American Museum, we were still fortunate enough to be able to build collections, to think intellectual questions of what we wanted to explore. But often you don't have that opportunity to do the kind of collecting like that. So part of it is to really look at your objects and your collections and say, are there different ways this can be interpreted? What does this tell me about the stories I want to tell? So I'm a firm believer that part of the strength of museums are new generations of curators coming in, asking different questions, or leaders who are basically saying, here's who we once were. Help me figure out who we can become as we move forward. That's the exciting thing about museums.
And Bonnie, I would add to that question that it's a fine balance yet you have to strike, I think, as a person responsible within a museum and responsible for the multiple dialogues with communities near and far, is that you want to offer relevant histories, narratives, but you also want to do justice to the fact that different areas in the history of humankind have had different value systems, different ways of understanding the world. And I mean that quite emphatically, because it's not only about knowing that the Incas or the Yoruba at different stages in their history would have set up their society in a certain way. And that in itself is very important to know. It is also that they had a chance and possibility to see the world, to understand the world, that we have lost. It's no longer there. We have something else now. And I think if you want to do justice to that, you have to have a contemporary approach. And at the same time, you have to help people to get into this from inside those historical moments. And at the same time, we do that right in the middle of our own value systems. They're more or less contested. They're always contested. And we have to strike a course that, as I said, is not narrowing down. It's not partial or partisan, but it opens up. And in the end, Lonnie, I think, and Bonnie, you've talked about that many times in our conversations. There is one moment which is absolutely irreducible and which is at the heart of the museum experience. You go into a place and you can study, you can take up the offer the museum makes. But then there's that other moment of revelation, of epiphany, when the object just hits you. You don't know why suddenly something explodes, something becomes relevant for your entire life. It even might change you. And I think it's those moments that we have to make possible when we do our work. And I think it's those two. You talked about trust the trust that museum institutions enjoy, where trust starts to fade away. And that's a big political and social challenge, I think. The trust in our institutions, the trust in our systems. But here, it's the absolute individual moment of experience, which you can't take away from an individual. It's the moment of freedom.
In some ways, what you're describing is the moment of wonder. Sometimes that moment of wonder is in engaging an artifact. Sometimes that moment of wonder is the engagement that comes from the conversations of people who don't know each other. I mean, one of the great strengths of museums is we create these informal communities, these informal learning communities, where people share their stories and they're made better. It's kind of like, I've always thought that the best museum experiences, exhibits, were when, almost like a backyard barbecue of my youth, right? That one person would engage and raise a question in certain ways. Another person would say, well, what about this? And in essence, by the time the conversation's over, you started at the same point, but now you've gone in very different directions and you've brought new knowledge, new sense of wonder. I mean, I do think that's the power of museums, is that there is a sense of wonder, and the key is to recognize there are different ways into that moment of wonder. And that makes us smarter when we embrace all the different ways into that wonder.
You know, when I started at the museum, and even up to now, you know, people would say things to me like, didn't you pour some libation before you went in there? Or how could you, you know, I can't even go up in there. I mean, and we have in the museum, as you know, the oldest African American object in existence that we think now is in the Akan drum, which is the name of these talks.
That's right.
And I love her because she connects with me, and she is where she is with me. That's how I feel about it. And she's in London and I'm in London, and that's my ancestral drum. And it makes the experience being inside the museum a personal one for me. Just two quick questions. What do you tell a young person who's thinking about going into museum work or is in museum work, either curate, whatever level, you know, why the hell are they doing that now at this point in time? And secondly, is it possible, especially for those of us who come from backgrounds of enslavement, colonialization, oppression, to be able to go into a museum that has objects of our ancestry and feel a connection, feel a purpose?
In some ways, what I tell people who are working in museums or want to work in museums is to recognize that what you're really doing is you're holding people's culture in your hands. What you're doing is making sure that you're creating a reservoir that people can dip into to understand themselves by understanding the culture that you're exploring, the history that you're exploring, the science that you're celebrating. So I want people to recognize that if you come to work in a museum, it is about the greater good. It's about how you're made better by the work you do, but it's not about you. I also think that I'm very struck by the need to take back from many communities their rights to be in a museum, right? I mean, my colleagues who are Native American used to always call the Natural History Museum of the Smithsonian the graveyard, the place of ghosts. And I think it's important to recognize that's the way many people view something. So how do you change that, or how do you build on that? I think that there is something that is people are thirsting for, which is connection to who they once were, who they maybe have no idea who they once were. And museums can help do that if we're willing to allow multiple points of view as we look at these materials. I just think that for me, you know, if you had said to me 40 years ago I'd be in museums, please, it never crossed my mind. But what I realized maybe more than anything else is that museums are this repository of who we once were, but more importantly, who we can become. And that excites me. And that means that museums are always going to have to be nimble in terms of the work they do to make sure that they're dealing with audiences not of yesterday, but of today. And I would argue one of the major impacts of this pandemic is that it's going to force us to know our audiences even better. We talk about knowing audiences, but I'm never convinced we really do. But now we have audiences that are worried about illness, are worried about technology, are worried about the future. To serve those audiences, we need to know them better. And that's going to be one of the challenges coming out of the pandemic, I think.
How do you, how do you know an audience, Lonnie, in the sense that, all museums, especially big museums, this museum, the Smithsonian, the Louvre, they have a lot of legends around them. There's a lot of, as you say, Indigenous Americans call the Smithsonian the graveyard, the boneyard, and let's face it, that's what you have to kind of get through in order to get the audience to come and see or to experience or to feel is the legends and the misinformation as well.
But isn't that, I would argue that what you're really getting at is this question of what does it mean to share authority? Because in some ways, what museums are, I always think museums are the last great craft guild, right? We want to keep things to only people who have the special knock or the secret handshake can really understand how we do the work we do. I think one of the challenges is for museums to open the veil, let people understand more about how we do the work we do. Yes, that gives way to some of the mystery that we love. But on the other hand, that's really about trust. That's really about allowing people to come as prepared as they can be to reap the benefits of museums, to challenge museums, to sort of help museums go in directions that we have not yet imagined. So for me, it's about, not deconstructing a museum per se, but it really is deconstructing it enough to open the veil. And that is frightening for some museums. But I think that if you want to be of service and of value, let people understand how you arrive at the conclusions you arrive at, how you make choices about collecting, and how do you ensure that public input is not just a program you do once a year, but it's really at the heart of understanding how you can be the effective communicator you want to be as a cultural institution.
And I think that also comprises looking at our own histories.
Yeah.
I think of the dedication in the hall of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, about a country is not afraid of facing its history, addressing flaws and correcting them. And I think museums are part of that process, of that continuous process of addressing your past, of facing your past in all its contradictions, in its violent parts, as well as in its humane and humanitarian parts, if you like. And I think when you say open the veil, then, Lonnie, it is also about speaking about the creation of the museums, the development of the museums, and how they've collected the world. And
I think that is so important. I think you've really put your finger on an issue. What I'm trying to do at the Smithsonian is to revisit how the Smithsonian has interpreted race throughout its history. Has it been a symbol sometimes for anti-racism, but often for racism? I think in some ways we can't model what we expect from the public if we don't look at ourselves and ask those hard questions. And that's tough, but I think it's really powerful. When I became secretary of the Smithsonian, it was really important for me to tell a story. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, was somebody that everybody wanted to hear from. In the 19th century, the Smithsonian Castle, the central old building, had the largest auditorium in Washington, and it brought amazing speakers to come talk about Civil War and the science. And Frederick Douglass was never invited in. And at one point, the head of the secretary of the Smithsonian said, no African American should speak at this great auditorium. So when I became secretary, the first thing I said was, Frederick Douglass is now speaking at the Smithsonian. And so in a way, being able to deal with who we once were is crucial, helping us become the institutions that we need to serve this complicated, diverse audiences that now expect much more from us, and rightly so.
Yeah, and I think, of course, our museums are very different. Now we're talking about the museum in a more generalizing way, but of course, when you look at it more closely, you realize that they are very different. They're very individual. They have different purposes, different histories, different profiles, and different communities. And one and the same museum, like the British Museum, for instance, is obviously a community museum because we are right in the middle of the county of Camden. And at the same time, there's global communities we work with, we do projects with across the globe as the Smithsonian. And we're engaging in the preservation and the exploration of cultural heritage across the globe. Tangible and intangible. And of course, doing this, you understand that there are very different views on what the museum is about, what collecting is about, because that's what underpins a museum. And you realize that as museums grow in an ever-growing number of locations across the world, that they have very different takes on what a museum is about and how it sits within the community. And I think it's part of reclamation that you also reclaim the meaning of what a museum is about. And that's part of the community work, if you like. Not for us alone to say, that's what the museum is about. You could say, the museum is a world country, a museum like the British Museum, and it is made up of communities from around the world who all have a say in this, and who all reclaim, and rightly so, a say in this, in defining and in transforming it. And I think it's important to be aware of that. And that's an ongoing process. And it's one of the most fascinating aspects of museum work.
I think that the notion that museums are not this stable block that has always been that way is really exciting. I think, as museums reach for new audiences, as museums ask different questions, it is a challenge. It's a challenge to staff. It's a challenge to traditional funders and supporters, but it also is the key to being that place of value. I keep coming back to that notion. Every museum, every country's museums think about value in different ways, and that's okay. As long as they recognize that their goal is to find ways through education, through illumination, through a sense of wonder, to find ways to help make a city, a region, a nation better. And for me, having that notion of what is the greater good is what would always propel museums to challenge themselves, to serve a variety of audiences, and to be places that are, yes, pillars of the past, pillars of academic ideas, but also pillars that are open to new conversations, to new audiences, to new understanding.
Lonnie, my last question is, I was very moved to find out that the Smithsonian was on Capitol Hill as soon as things calmed down to collect What happened on Capitol Hill, I'm not sure people deeply, I mean, we saw it, but also it was the first time that this had happened since the War of 1812, when the British had invaded Washington. Also, thousands of people, our ancestors died so that the Confederate battle flag would never be there. And it was marched through the Capitol. It was an outrage. So we know what that was. You and I know what was going on. Many people know what was going on deeply. What will the Smithsonian say about this? Or what do you think you beginning to say about this?
Well, it was important, as you know, for museums to collect today for tomorrow. And I created a sort of rapid response group whose job it is at important moments, we talk about it and go get it. And I think this insurrection is going to be one of the most important moments of understanding the 21st century. And I think that it was incumbent on the Smithsonian to collect this material, to do the research, the oral histories. And so therefore we first have that, because, you know, you can remember early in my career, I would want to do work and there weren't collections. The stories that I thought were important, other folks didn't think were important. So I want to make sure that those stories are there. But also, I think it's important to recognize that by collecting that moment, it allows us, yes, to talk about this insurrection, but it also allows us to talk about race. It allows us to talk about sort of the battle for the soul of a nation. And it really allows us to ask the fundamental question: is America a place that is a work in progress but is trying to live up to its stated ideals? Or is it a place that wants to return to a past that maybe never really existed, a past where there was more exclusionary than inclusion? And I want to make sure that as we grapple with that history and what that means, that the Smithsonian is there. For me, the Smithsonian has to be a place that is fearless when it comes to collecting these important stories. Whether it's collecting a Confederate monument, whether it's collecting, you know, as I did for the Museum of Ku Klux Klan, a racist organization's outfit. The key is you've got to be bold enough to collect so that you can then be brave enough to interpret going forward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bonnie, I'm afraid we've already slightly overstretched. I think we have to bring it to a close here. I want to thank you, Lonnie, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation that has touched upon so many, I think, absolutely vital points, vital aspects of the museum as it's situated at the heart of our societies, and is a place of debate, and is a place of knowledge, and is a place of dialogue, and is a place where you activate cultural heritage as your own resource, be it recent history or even the present, be it the remote past. I think if that is fine by you, Lonnie, we should have a second conversation. Forgive me for putting this so bluntly to you, and I'm sure Bonnie agrees with me. We've not been able to have questions from the audience. I know that they would have loved to engage with you more directly. So perhaps if that's fine by you, sometime soon we could reconvene, and this time perhaps reflect on what we said today, but then also open it up to the public.
Count on me. Just let me know when you want me to show up, and I'll get out of a budget meeting again, and I'll smile and be happy to work with you. So
Thank you,
I
Lonnie.
can't thank you enough.
Thank
You guys
so
are
much.
the best.
See you soon. All the best, and stay safe.
Thank you. See you
All right,
soon.
thank you.
Stay
Take
safe.
care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye,
Bye
Lonnie.
now.
Bye-bye.